we welcome our remote worshipers today as we join Great Falls Seventh-day Adventist Church as we get into the Word today, and we join with many others around the world as we look at God's Word. We continue in our sermon series entitled Family Matters. We are wrapping this up, Family Matters. The purpose of the series is, or the premise is that understanding our families enables understanding ourselves. Self-understanding enables self-improvement, and our ultimate purpose is personal spiritual growth. Now, in this series, we have talked about the fact that there are no perfect families. Anybody remember that? Are there any perfect families here? No? Still? No? Okay. Someone said maybe? Okay. There are no perfect families. Spiritual well-being is emotional well-being. So, folks, if we are not well emotionally, we are not well spiritually. That's all there is to it. And if we're well emotionally, we are well spiritually. So that was one of the messages we brought. We talked about we are called to perfect love. The perfection that God calls us to is not the perfection many of us think about, being sinlessly perfect, but rather to perfect love. And our last time together, we talked about how we can break the generational curse. We break the generational curse by aligning ourselves with God. If you missed any in the series, feel free to go online and review them. Some of them are on Shoto's YouTube page. All of them are on Great Falls YouTube page. So feel free to check out either one if you missed any and are interested in going back. And feel free to like them and share them while you're at it. So the question for today is, how do you see yourself? How do you see yourself? What do you think about yourself? Are you good? Are you all right? Do you like yourself? Or, wish you were somebody else? Sometimes wonder why were you born in the first place? We see ourselves differently. And while it would be nice if we all had positive self-perceptions, not all of us do. In fact, at some point, all of us have less than ideal self-perceptions. Much of what we believe about ourselves comes from our childhood. The voices and the feedback we got as children make deep impacts in our lives. If we heard a lot of negative things about ourselves as children, chances are we grow up with a negative self-perception. If we hear a lot of positive things about ourselves as children, we may develop positive self-perception. So what we experience as children is very important. Now, truth be told, not everything we believe about ourselves is true, is it? Sometimes we think we're doing all right and we just don't know. You realize the day the doctor tells you you have cancer, that's not the day you got cancer, right? You've had cancer for a while. So sometimes we think we're okay, but we just don't know. People ask me, how you doing? Sometimes I say, I think I'm well. Now they ask, don't you? Hey, I think I'm well. I feel well. I'd like to believe I'm well. You know, as long as I don't go to the doctor's office, I can keep believing. Who knows what's going on? But our self-perception is not always true. Our point this morning is that false self-perception is harmful. I want us to be mindful of that. False self-perception is harmful. I want you to go with me as we get into the word to Romans 12. Here Paul gives us an admonition. He says to us, or actually he said to the church in Rome, and we apply it to us, for I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but think soberly as God has dealt to each one a measure Paul warns the church, Paul warns the congregation, don't think you are more than what you are. Let's not get big-headed. Let's not get puffed up with what we think about ourselves. Paul shared this when some felt more entitled than others in the church. What follows in Paul's writing is an admonition to function within the body according to the gifts and roles that God has given. False self-perception. When we think too highly of ourselves, we step on those around us and we don't even know we're doing it. When we think too lowly of ourselves, we fail God and we fail those around us. So, my friends, it's important for us to be mindful of this because how we see ourselves impacts how we relate to God and others. I believe personally that too many Christians suffer from low self-esteem. I don't know if you believe that, but I've been around Christians for a little bit, okay, a few decades. Been at this thing for a little while. And it's my personal perception without doing in-depth analytical studies and just my perception is there are probably more Christians with low self-esteem than there are with high self-esteem. Of course, when we read things like less of me, more of you, there's nothing good in us, and some of our theology fosters this low self-esteem among Christians. But is that necessary? Is that how we should see ourselves? Should we be satisfied with low self-esteem? At first, low self-esteem comes across as humility. We sometimes even mistake it for humility. But it's not. Over time, low self-esteem turns out to be or proves itself to be a debilitating form of self-absorption. I'm so bad. I'm so terrible. I'm the worst there is. Woe is me. Whoa, I am the worst. Now, it's a form of self-absorption just as much as pride is. So I want us today to explore a couple of characters in the Bible. Will we do that? Let's get in the Word together. Let's explore a couple of characters in the Bible and see if there are some lessons we can draw from them. We begin in 1 Samuel 9, and the character there is Saul. Saul is a young man at the time, and his father has lost his donkeys, and Saul is sent out to find his donkeys along with one of the servants. And they look around, and eventually they're told about the seer or prophet who is in town. So they go to find Samuel. And Samuel gives them instruction. I will meet with you at a certain place and time. They meet up with Samuel. Let's get into the conversation there in chapter 9, verse 20. And Samuel talking to Saul, and he says, "But your donkeys that were lost 3 days ago, do not be anxious about them, for they have been found." And get this weird change of topic, like sudden left turn in the conversation. "And on whom is all the desire of Israel? Is it not on you and all your father's house?" That was an abrupt change of topic, wasn't it? And Saul answered and said, "Am I not a Benjamite? Of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then do you speak to me like this?" Even Saul found the conversation weird. I'm coming asking about the donkeys. You have told me that the donkeys have been found, and suddenly this change in the conversation. On whom is all the desire of Israel? Is it not on you and all your father's house? Well, Samuel goes on to anoint Saul king. He tells him that he will be king. And just to confirm, Samuel gives him 3 signs. Sign number one is you leave here, you're going to see two men with donkey, and they will let you know. These two men will let you know that your donkeys were found. And from there, you're going to go on to the next place, and you're going to see three men, and they're going to give you a couple loaves of bread. These three men, you've not met them before, and from there, you're going to keep going, and then you're going to run into the prophets, and they'll be prophesying. And next thing you know, you'll be prophesying. And it happens exactly as Samuel says. All of these signs to confirm to Saul that what God has said will happen. You will be king of Israel. So if God has given you a message, what's the appropriate thing? If God has given you a promise, what is the appropriate thing to do with that promise? Maybe believe it, maybe accept it. So let's fast forward a little bit in the narrative. And now Samuel is calling all of Israel together at Mizpah. They're going to select publicly the king, and they go through a process. And they cast lots by tribes, and God is speaking in front of everybody that tell Samuel who to pick, and they go through all the tribes. You'll pick Benjamin, and then you'll pick the house of Kish, and then they select Saul. But where's Saul? Where's Saul? Nobody knows where Saul is. In verse 22 of chapter 10, we discover they inquired of the Lord, and has a man come yet? And the Lord answered, there he is, hidden among the equipment. Now, God told you you're supposed to be king. What are you doing hiding behind the equipment? You're supposed to be where God told you to be. You're supposed to be ready for the moment. But I would propose to you that Saul had a self-esteem issue. It wasn't just humility. Humility is one thing. Humility is not tooting your own horn and not touting your accomplishments, but knowing how to be appropriate for the moment. But this is not humility. This is a self-doubt, an insecurity. This is a fear that is natural to Saul. It's part of his personality. So as we go on observing Saul's life, we discover a few things. Number one, he's a fearful man. And number two, he has poor impulse control. And we see that at Gilgal when Samuel is supposed to meet Saul there, and Saul waits for Samuel, and 7 days pass, and Saul is getting concerned that things are getting out of hand, and Samuel isn't showing up. So instead of checking himself and staying in his lane, Saul goes ahead and offers a sacrifice that he had no right to do. Samuel shows up and he challenges Saul, like, what in the world are you doing? Jump over to chapter 13, if you would. We're going to pick up at verse 11. Saul says to Samuel, when I saw the people were scattered from me, and that that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, then I said, the Philistines will now come down to me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord. Therefore I felt compelled and offered a burnt offering. You know what happens next in the story, right? If you don't, keep reading. Samuel says to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandments of Yahweh your God, which he commanded you. For now, Yahweh would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. Do you see the problem here? Eventually, Saul was rejected. And the problem with low self-esteem is that we are subject to our own fears and we are subject to our own failures. Let's not confuse low self-esteem with humility. Those are not the same thing. But I want us to consider another case today. Let's look at another king of Israel. This one did not have a low self-esteem issue. He started just as Saul, rather humbly. In fact, his humility was admirable. Take a look at 1 Kings 3, beginning at verse 7. And Solomon is offering a prayer to God, and he says, "Now, Yahweh my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I am a little child. I do not know how to go to I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore, give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?" Does that sound like humility? Sounds like humility to me. You don't see that Solomon has a low self-esteem problem. He realizes the task is bigger than he is, and he prays to God. But something happens in the life of Solomon that I'm afraid happens in too many lives. We know the rest of Solomon's life, right? We know how he became rich. God, told him, "Ask me what you want." Well, we're in that prayer, and he asked for wisdom and a mind of knowledge. But eventually things get out of hand, and Solomon just gets more and more and more and more. Join me in 1 Kings chapter 6. A narrative about Solomon here, picking up at the last couple verses of chapter 6, and we're going to the first verse of chapter 7. In the 4th year, the foundation of the house of Yahweh was laid in the month of Ziv. And in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its details and according to all its plans. That's nice and boring, right? Here's the point. So he, Solomon, was 7 years in building it being the house of God, right? The temple. Took 7 years to build the house. But go to the next verse. It's the next chapter. But Solomon took how long? But Solomon took 13 years to build his own house. So he finished all his house. How long did we say for the house of God? How much for Solomon's house? What's up with that? Now we can think, well, David had lined up all the lumber. He had lined up everything. It was just basically a matter of Solomon saying, "Go forward." And so it was a lot, the construction was David's doing. I mean, he had even the nails prepared. Everything was just on standby for Solomon to lead out. But let's compare two passages side by side. Take a look at chapter 6, verse 2, and chapter 7, 1 and 2. Chapter 6 tells us, "Now the house which King Solomon built for Yahweh, its length was how long? 60 cubits. Very good. And the width was how much? 20 cubits. And the height was how much? 30 cubits. So it was 60 by 20 by 30. Okay? We've got the dimensions in our heads on our notes. Now, how big is the house that Solomon built for himself? Take a look at verse 2 there. He also built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits. How big was the house of God? How many cubits long? How big is Solomon's house? Ooh, okay. And the width of Solomon's house is how big? And the width of God's house is how much? 30. 20, correct. The height is 30. The width was, let me make sure I'm looking right. Yes, 20. So are you seeing the picture? Solomon takes twice as long to build his own house, and it's bigger than God's house. What does that tell us about Solomon? How many of you were at our leadership retreat? Let me see your hands. Okay. One of those presentations, we had the cycle, the organizational life cycle. You remember that? We start out with a vision, and then we go to organization, and somewhere at the top, we plateau, right? And then there's the downhill that comes. Is when things start falling apart and eventually the organization dies. Now, when does death, if you recall from our workshop, when does death begin for an organization? Right at the top, where success happens. Immediately after success, the organization begins to die. Well, we look at Solomon's life, and what was the first and most successful thing that Solomon did? He built the temple. And after that, well, he figured that was pretty cool. I can do this again. So for himself, he takes it up a notch, doesn't he? And that was the beginning of his downfall. Solomon felt so good about his success, so good about his achievement, that he decided to outdo himself. Solomon's success with the temple's construction project gave him the hubris to build himself a house that was bigger than God's. My friends, when we get bigger than God, our downfall begins. When we are more important than God, we are on the way to failure. When we are so confident about ourselves that we can outdo for us what we have done for God, we are in trouble. Now, while both Saul and Solomon both started out humble, one had poor or low self-esteem and failed God. The other had elevated self-esteem and also failed God. Thinking too much or too little of ourselves is dangerous stuff. How we see ourselves impacts how we relate to God and others. So then the question today is, how shall we see ourselves? How should we see ourselves? Well, here's when you start taking notes if you haven't already. I propose to us today that we should see ourselves through God's perspective. Now, what's God's perspective? Well, Genesis 1:27 tells us what God's perspective is. It tells us that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, created he them, or he created them. Now, you've heard me use that verse before, I'm sure, and some of you may be asking, does this pastor know another verse of the Bible? I actually know two more, okay, just in case you wanted to know. But this verse is so fundamental to our identity as children of God. This verse is so fundamental to our identity as humans. What makes us different than all the other creatures in the world? What makes us different than all the other animals is the fact that we were made in the image of God. Bigger animals have not accomplished what we have accomplished. Animals with larger brains have not designed the things that we have designed. Stronger animals have not created societies that we have created. We are different because we were made in the image of God. Therefore, we should see ourselves through God's perspective, according to the way God sees us. God sees us as his image. That is why so many times in the Bible, God will say, be perfect because I am perfect. Be holy because I am holy. You are made in my image. Your purpose is to reflect me. So start acting like me. Be holy as I am holy. Some time ago, before moving up here, I was driving. I had one of my daughters in the car. And we're just driving around Atlanta. Don't ask me where we were going. That was irrelevant, and I've forgotten that. But we happened to notice a particular car. It had a nice paint job. You could tell it was well kept. It was very carefully maintained. And I noticed something about the car. I noticed the symbol on the car. It said Rolls Royce. It had the Rolls Royce symbol, double R's in there. It was Rolls Royce. All the symbols on the car said Rolls Royce. And I pointed the car out to my daughter. I said, you know what that symbol is there? No, not really. Some folk don't know a whole lot about cars. My daughters are kind of like that. Got four wheels on the outside, one on the inside. That's all you need to know. Well, I pointed out to the daughter that that's the Rolls Royce symbol right there. That's one of the most expensive cars that mass produce. Costs, it costs more. And then I pointed out to my daughter that is Lincoln Town Car. Somebody went and put Rolls Royce symbols on a Lincoln Town Car. They shined it up. It was pretty. It was nice. It was well kept. And maybe they really wanted to have a Rolls Royce, but could only afford a used Lincoln Town Car. It wasn't the latest model either. So they went and put Rolls Royce symbols on their town car. Question: was it a Rolls Royce? No, it was not a Rolls Royce. My friends, the identity comes from the maker. The identity comes from the manufacturer. Our identity comes from our manufacturer. We are the image of God. We are the children of God. We can be banged up, bruised up, messed up, torn up, but we are still the image of God, and changing our label does not change that. Mind you, the better condition we're in is the better God looks. But regardless of our condition, we are the image of God. So let's act like it. Let's act like we matter. Let's act like we have a Father. Let's act like we are loved. Let's act like God wants us to. Let's reflect the proper image of God. We get our image from, we get our identity from our Maker. So, first thing we need to do is to see ourselves through God's perspective. Second thing we need to do is see ourselves in light of God's power. You say, what? Yes. We are not weaklings. We are not unable to do anything. We have the power of God. Some of it innately in us, but much of it accessible to us. God's power is accessible to all of us. We're not called to be wimpy, whiny, weakling Christians. We're called to demonstrate the power of God in this world. That's why Paul reminds Timothy, hey, we are not given a spirit of fear, but a power, love, and a sound mind. We have the power to reflect God in this world. We have the power to make a difference in this world. We have the power to experience miracles in this world. We have the power to demonstrate God's love in this world. We have the power to stand in this. We have the power to be the head and not the tail in this world. We have the power to thrive in this world. But you say, if we have the power, why can't we see it? Well, I tell you this, the power of God is manifested through us when we obey, not when we try to show it off. Sometimes I hear of churches that they announce ahead of time that there's going to be a healing service and the power of God's going to be demonstrated. And they put on a show. I mean, stuff happens. There's a lot of energy in the room. But is that the power of God? Or is that a moment? My friends, we demonstrate the power of God through our obedience. The power of God, we show the power of God to heal. We have the power of God, and we can show the power of God to heal. See, the power of God to heal leprosy was manifested when Naaman dunked himself in a dirty river 7 times. We manifest the power of God as did Moses when Moses led God's people to a dead end road by a river. We demonstrate the power of God as did Gideon when when he entered the battle with 300 unarmed men. We can show the power of God when we see the power of God, when some men opted to be cooked alive rather than to bow themselves to the image of the greatest power on earth at the time. We see the power of God when fishers left their family business to follow Jesus. We see the power of God when apostles waited on the Holy Spirit. We see the power of God when we obey God. And people see his power in us when we do so. My friends, we need to see ourselves in light of the power of God. So, how shall we see ourselves? We said we need to see ourselves through God's perspective. We need to see ourselves through God's power. We also need to see ourselves within God's limits. I said God's limits, yes. Would you agree with me that we live in a world of more, and more? In a world where more is better, bigger is typically better, more is preferred. Do you know of anyone who has made a conscious decision to make less money next year? I mean, we just had too much money last year. We probably should cut back. Do you know anyone who has made that decision? I'm not familiar with that. We tend to always want more. We made 100, let's make 110. Let's make 120. Were we successful? Let's take it up a notch. We always tend to want more. In the Garden of Eden, there was that one tree nobody was supposed to touch. Why do you think that was? I'll propose to you it was there so that Adam and Eve could obey. They had all the freedom they wanted. This one tree, I propose to you that it was probably no different than all the other trees in its appearance. Just another tree, and God said, don't touch that one. Why? So that you can obey. Just so that you can submit your will to God's. And one little limit. But as humans, we have a tendency not to want God's limits on our lives. God gives us limits. Sabbath is a limit. Imagine our lives if God didn't tell us to rest one day. How often would we be working? Weeks at a time, not even days at a time, weeks at a time until we burnt out. Right? I'm sorry? More than others. Yeah. God gives us limits. Says, work 6 days, stop. I'll take care of you on that last day. I got you. I'll make your bread last from Friday through Saturday. Trust me, God gives us limits. You know that tithe is a limit, right? That God puts on us. So you made your money, now give me back 1/10. Why? So that you can trust me. So that you can accept my limit. So that you can be more aware of what you're keeping than you would be otherwise. Just so you have to go through the mathematical process of calculating what you've got. It's a limit that God imposes on us just so that we can find ourselves in his will. Let me show you a limit. I figure this one is sort of relevant to a farmer's life or a rancher's life. Farmer's life, I should say. Let me show you a limit that's seldom talked about in churches. Leviticus 19, beginning at verse 9. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field, nor shall you gather all the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape on your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am Yahweh your God. What is God saying there? He's saying, don't take it all. Leave for others. Don't reap to the very edges. Now, uh, you understand the context in which this was written or intended as farming communities, and those farms were a lot smaller than our farms are today. Uh, the poor and those who were on hard time would have the option to be able to and pick the edges of certain people's fields and feed themselves. That was the built-in welfare system into the Jewish economy, or I should say into the Hebrew economy. That was their built-in system. Now, today, if you don't reap the edges of your field, I am pretty sure there's no homeless person coming from Great Falls to reap for themselves, okay? I don't think that's going to do any good. However, how can we apply the principle? Maybe all of us, whether we're farmers or not, ought to be mindful that we should hold back just a little bit for the persons in need. Because someone in our lives will be in need. We will at some point come into contact with someone that is experiencing a hardship. Should we use all our money on ourselves? No, we should have a little left over to help others when they struggle. That's a biblical principle. That is living within God's limits. Make sure some of your resources are reserved for the poor and the stranger. Aside from your tithe, make sure you keep some resources back to help around you. My friends, when we accept God's limits in our lives, we accept that God is bigger than we are and God knows best. When we embrace God's limits, God looms large in our lives. So what have we said? We need to see ourselves how? Through God's perspective, through God's power, and within it, through God's limits. I propose to you today, my friends, that we reveal God to the world when we have healthy self-perceptions. When we see ourselves as God sees us, when we see ourselves in the light of his power, when we accept his limits, the world will see God through us. Peter reminded the church that, take a look at 2 Peter 1:3, that God's power has given us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of Jesus. My friends, we have all that we need. We have all that we need when we believe God. We are who we should be when we trust God. We accomplish all we're called to accomplish when we obey God. So I say to you, let's embrace our God-given identity. Let's believe what God has said about us. Let's trust his power to see us through. Let's accept what he has for us.